Hey everybody, I'm still Steve. I guess I can be a little bit more center. But this is not Sports with Steve. This is a special episode-ish, special video highlight of NFL penalties. There are a lot of questionable calls. We of course had the referees, the replacement referees in the Packers game, Packers-Seahawks, touchdown, incomplete pass, don't know. So this is a bit of a comprehensive view of what I feel alike, may not be Sports with Steve, but I still can't speak. What I feel like are some questionable penalties and penalties that could be used in this opportunity to explain them a little bit farther. So I'm going to need a test dummy, someone to beat up on, and that'll be our cameraman Scott. Go ahead and join us, Scott. I think this is the first time you'll be on camera, Scott.
Actually, yes it is.
Hey, say hi, Scott.
Hello.
And there's Scott. The person reading off the penalties that I want to do is Kellen Smith. If you remember, we interviewed him and my other roommate Lindsey Johnson last year. Man, that was a long time ago. So his sweet, sultry voice will call out the penalties. So why don't we go ahead and get started and I'll explain them. Sometimes I'll use Scott, sometimes I won't. Just depends on what the penalty is. I'll try and give a good, hopefully brief description of what each penalty is. Okay, Kellen, what's the first one?
The first one is having fewer than 7 players on line.
Okay, so what that means is this is an offensive penalty. Offensive line, 5 people on the line. You have to have 7 people on the line and they have to be balanced. So you have to have 5 and you have to have 1 on either side. Meaning on the line means if the line of scrimmage were to be right here, and it's hard to see, it were to be right here, you have to be on the line. Your head has to be on the line, your foot has to be on the line without being over. And you check that by looking down the line at the football. You can also look down at the referee. If you see a wide receiver go like this, with his left arm out or his right arm out, depending on which side, pointing to the referee, and the referee points forward, that means that he is on the line. He's checking. He's allowed to check, and he's allowed to move a little bit to get on the line. If a wide receiver is off the line and he points backward, and the referee points backward, that's agreeing that they're off the line. So you have to have a balanced line. You have to have 1 person on either side. If you do not, then that is a 5-yard penalty to the offense. You don't lose it down. I think there are only 3 loss of down penalties, but only 2 are really called. What's the next one?
The next one is neutral zone infraction.
Okay, this is a defensive penalty. This is a relatively new penalty. It used to be the defense could jump and hawk at the offensive line and cause them to move. Now if a defensive lineman moves forward towards the offensive lineman and causes him to jump out of a set, it is only the offensive lineman that's in relative condition. There was a call earlier this season where a wide receiver was looking down the line, defensive end jumped, and the wide receiver, jumped. But that is not neutral zone infraction. That is a false start because that wide receiver was not on the line in front of that defensive end. The offensive line has to make a reactionary jump in order to get called on the defense. It's a 5-yard penalty, a gain of 5 yards, quote unquote, for the offense. But if the offensive lineman takes more than a second, it feels like that it's not a reactionary to the defensive lineman coming over, then that is a false start on the offense and a loss of 5 yards. Next penalty.
The next one is player not reporting change in eligibility.
This is an offensive one. This is where you can be on the line. As long as you have 7 guys on the line, any one of them can be eligible if they are not covered up. Reported change in eligibility. Some numbers are ineligible automatically. I think numbers in the 60s and 70s are ineligible. But you can become ineligible if you tell a referee, the head referee, that you are eligible. So they have defensive linemen come in as a fullback. He has to report eligible, or a 6th offensive lineman. Because his number is ineligible automatically, he can report eligible, which means that he can be one of the 5 receivers to go out for a pass. He can be past 5 yards. If you are eligible one play, and then you are ineligible the next play, if you remain out there but you're in a different position, such as a punt, you have to report ineligible, because now you are ineligible. So failure to report, which is just a check-in just for the referees to know not to throw the 5-yard penalty on you. Failure to do so, whether to report eligible or ineligible, is a loss of 5 yards.
Next one is pausing less than 1 second after a shift.
Okay, so a shift, this is purely if you're on the line. If you're behind the line, if you're one of the 4 backs, whether it's the 3rd wide receiver, the slot wide receiver, or if you're in a wishbone set, the 3 running backs, if you are off the line, you can move backward or laterally as much as you need to, only 1. But if you are on the line, you have to be on the line for at least a second. So if you have the 5 offensive linemen and then you have 1 wide receiver over on the right on the line, and you come across as a tight end from the right to the left, you have to be on the line. So you have to be on the line, and the quarterback has to wait a second before the ball is snapped. If they do not, that's an illegal legal formation, loss of 5 yards for the offense.
Next one is second forward pass.
Second forward pass, pretty self-explanatory. A forward pass is anything that's forward. I know I'm pretty sure Phil Simms says in order for a forward pass to be forward, it has to go forward. Pretty self-explanatory. But a lateral pass, a straight lateral pass, is not a pass. That is a running play or a toss back. So if you were to toss, and the referee, the lineman referee, if they were to point back, that's not a forward pass. If they were to point forward, that is a forward pass. So you have to pay attention to that. So if you see a referee point forward on a lateral, that means that it's a forward pass. And then if that wide receiver throws the ball, this Antoine Randall L with the Steelers used to do this. The Wildcat, they started doing it a little bit more. If he were to throw the ball again, that would be a second forward pass, and that is a loss of down and 5 yards.
Next one is illegal touch of forward pass.
Illegal touch of forward pass is an offensive lineman. He can't touch the ball unless somebody else were to touch it first. Actually, there are a couple different variations of this. It's called illegal touching. I'm pretty sure it's this. Illegal touching. A lineman cannot go after the ball. He cannot try and swat down the ball. He can't do that. If the quarterback were to be getting hit and the lineman were to get hit with the ball on a bad pass, that's not illegal touching because he had no control over that. But if the offensive lineman were to actively go after a ball and touch it before another person does, that is a loss of, I'm not sure if that's a loss of down. It's at least a loss of 5 yards. I can't remember if that's a loss of down. Another variation is if a wide receiver were to go out of bounds. If a wide receiver is out of bounds, he's out of the play. Unless a defensive back touches it first. Then it can be, as long as he establishes himself back in, then he can touch the ball. If he does not do so, that's an illegal touching. Next penalty. Illegal
player downfield on pass.
Another offensive lineman. You cannot go 3 yards, I think, 3 or 5. It used to be 5, it might only be 3 now. You cannot go 3 yards past the line of scrimmage as an offensive lineman on a passing play until the ball is thrown, or until a receiver catches the ball, such as in the flat. On a running play, you can run down as much as you want. This type of play happens a lot with scrambling quarterbacks. If an offensive lineman were to see his quarterback scrambling, he's going to think run, he's going to go down and block the linebackers or the safeties. That's perfectly illegal unless and as long as the quarterback does not throw the ball. As soon as the quarterback throws the ball, then a 5-yard penalty comes out because the offensive linemen are not allowed that far downfield to block someone if the quarterback is going to pass. Next.
Kicking team player voluntarily out of bounds during your punt.
Okay, this is, you have the 2 gunners on the outside in most punt formations, so 2 gunners on the outside. And in order to avoid the blocking, usually defensive backs or wide receivers, and in order to avoid them, they might run out of bounds. If they were to do that on their own volition with their own power, that they can't touch anybody, they can't do anything. If they were to get knocked out of bounds, they have to make an immediate attempt to get back in bounds. They have to try to stay in the field of play. If you get knocked out of bounds, that's going to happen because you're on the outside. But if you were to get knocked out of bounds, run 3 yards, and then try and come back, you are illegally out of bounds. If you were to get knocked out and immediately try and come back in, then you were fair. And the defensive back, the people who are blocking you, have to give you a chance to come back in bounds, so they can't just hold on to you out of bounds. Next.
Making invalid fair catch signal.
Invalid fair catch. A fair catch signal is anything above your head. A lot of this, you don't see this very often, but some of this might be like this, where it's close to being, you want to confuse the defense that you were calling a fair catch, but you're not really calling a fair catch, or if you were to call a fair catch and then run with the ball. This confuses the defense, this increases the chance of injury, which the NFL rightly is erring on the side of caution, both for the defensive backs and for the punt returner. I think it's a 5-yard loss. The catch still counts, but I think it's a 5-yard loss.
Holding an opponent who is not the runner other than to ward off an opponent.
Okay, so this is holding. Defensive holding. It's a 5-yard automatic first down. Most defensive penalties are automatic first downs, which is why defensive penalties are so killer. It's past the 5 yards. You're allowed to contact someone. If I want to finally get Scott involved, you're allowed to hit someone and hold on to him for a second. Within 5 yards, that's perfectly legal. But if you were to let go, or if you were to hook him around the waist before the ball is thrown, or to someone who is not the receiver, that's a 5-yard penalty and automatic first down. So because you are inhibiting that player from being able to go after the ball or continue their route. Next.
Pass interference by Team A.
Okay, Team A would be the offense in this instance. And this is from NFL.com. So Team A is offense, Team B is defense. And this is where we get a little bit of help from Scott. because pass interference, there are several variations of pass interference, and I'm actually going to describe both pass interferences. So this will take a little bit. So offensive pass interference. There's two basic types of pass interference for offense. Offensive pass interference is called very, very rarely. Pass interference, engage me a little bit. So here's the defense. If I were to fully extend my arms as an offense and push off, that is pass interference because I'm giving myself a better chance. But as an offense, if I were to just not extend my elbow, then that is not pass interference. Okay, and the defense is allowed, your contact is allowed. The referees now especially are allowing more contact. But if the offensive man were to fully extend his arms and push off, then that is offensive pass interference, not called very often. Or if he were to, drag the defender down, that sort of thing. An obvious pass interference where he's trying to get access to the ball better. Another pass interference is something that's also not called very often. This is called a pick play. This is where, and I wish I had two more guys. A wide receiver, you might have, we'll go with two wide receivers. So you have the slot wide receiver, and the outside wide receiver. If they were to have a crossing route, and the slot receiver and these two were to cross, the defensive backs would have to cross, so they'd most likely run into each other. But if the slot receiver were to deliberately run into a defensive back to get him off this wide receiver, that's offensive pass interference. That's peeling, that's picking, that's illegal. If it were to be in the natural act of a wide receiver route, then that's unintentional. And it's very hard to call because people run into each other all the time. And how can you tell an intent of a wide receiver unless he were to just be staring down a defensive back? So offensive pass interference does not necessarily have to be with the wide receiver that's actively involved in the catch attempt. That's offensive pass interference, not called very often. And I think that's a loss of 10. No loss of down, but a loss of 10 yards for the offense. Defensive pass interference is called a ton more often. This is where pass interference can be called on the defense. If the ball is coming this way and both of us are looking this way, both of us are looking to the ball, a lot of contact is allowed, unless it's obvious deliberate contact, or if I were to punch Scott in the face or rip him down.
What about like tripping? Would that be considered?
If you're both looking at the ball, that's incidental tripping because you're both concentrating on the ball.
Okay.
If you're the wide receiver in this instance and you're looking at the ball and I'm not, pretty much any contact is going to be pass interference because I do not have focus on the ball.
That makes much more
There's
sense.
also face guarding, which is where a defensive back, usually a defensive back, and I'll do this just so that the ball is behind me, and you have your arms out like that. So face guarding is where I just go like this. So I'm not looking at the ball, but I'm not letting him catch it. Not letting him see it. That's defensive pass interference. Defensive pass interference can also be called, usually on a cross route, if I were to turn that way. If the ball were to be coming this way, and I were to have my hand on his back, and I were to pull his hip and move him, any sort of movement that deters him from allowing him to catch the ball is defensive pass interference. If I were to just have it, a lot of times you see it early, coming across and knock the ball down. If I do not inhibit, or I do not move him as a defensive back, most of the time that will not be called. Same with holding. If I do not inhibit him from his route, I can have a hand on him. As long as it's not grasping him, as long as it's not moving him, I can have a hand on him as a defensive back. So that's the basic tenets of pass interference. This is why you see it a lot on defense. Pretty much they're going to err on the side of defensive pass interference. You see a lot of wide receivers asking for the penalty after the play. Defensive backs saying, no, I did not interfere with the pass. You see that a lot. As a defense, that's spot foul, which means that wherever the foul occurred, that's where the ball goes, and an automatic first down. If it happened in the end zone, outside of the 2-yard line, so if it happened from the 4-yard line or from your 4-yard line, and it happened in the end zone, so that'd be a 96-plus yard pass. Wow. I like to see the quarterback that could do that. Then the ball is placed at the 2-yard line. If it happens in the 2-yard line, if you're on the 1-yard line, or if you're on the 2-yard line, and pass interference occurs in the end zone, it's half the distance to the goal from there on. So that's defensive pass interference and offensive pass interference.
Next one is assisting runner.
Assisting runner. This is hardly ever called. If you watch The Longest Yard with Adam Sandler, you saw this. This is where a running back gets hit, defensive players get stopped, and then an offensive lineman comes back and pushes the pile. Usually you estimate contact with the running back, so pushes the running back. A lot of the times this is allowed because offensive linemen won't directly push the running back. They'll push a defensive back that's on the running back. They're still moving the running back and moving the pile, but it's not called because they can't directly be related to moving the running back themselves. It's very rarely called. It actually very rarely happens to where a big scrum like that occurs. Next.
Batting or punching ball when loose unless a pass towards opponent's goal line or in any direction if in the end zone.
Okay, so illegal batting, which I think is still this one. A lot of call up, I think, are this one. You can't bat a ball forward. You can't bat a ball. I think you can. If you're on the boundary, if you're on the out, you can bat the ball back in bounds, but you can't knock it towards someone unless you were to pick it up, have control of it, and throw it back as a lateral. You can't just push the ball around. You won't get credit for that. You have to have control of it first. If that happens where you do not have control of it first, if you're the defense and you never got control of a fumble, then the possession remains with the offense. If you did get control, if you were to get control, push it back, and then someone else pushes it forward, you still have control of the ball. So you lose yards, but you would still have the ball. This has to occur, on a fumble, so it doesn't occur that much, and players usually try and pick it up, or it's on the boundary. It's perfectly fine to try and keep it out of bounds, but you can't push it forward and you can't push it back. You have to make an attempt to grab it unless you have full possession of the ball. Then you can pitch it laterally. And that might be 5 or 10 yards. 10 yards?
Yes.
Yes, 10 yards. Next.
Interfering with fair catch and catch is rewarded.
Okay, so this is catch interference. Very rarely happens on kickoffs unless it's a squib kick. You cannot run into the player. So if you were to declare a fair catch, and if you were waiting for the ball, I cannot hit you. I cannot run into you. I can't bat the ball out of the way either. I can actually push another of your teammates into you as long as I'm engaged in the blocking. I can't rip someone into you, make it intentional, but I can push someone into you. And they've gotten rid of the halo rule, which means that I can't be closer to you than this. Now they've gotten rid of that. It's about 2 feet to give a player a fair chance. But as long as I'm not touching you and I'm not interfering with your catch, then you can still make the catch. That's a 15-yard penalty, and the catch is awarded at that spot. So even if you were to fumble, they would still get the ball. The receiving team would.
At the same spot where it happened.
No, 15 yards forward.
Oh yeah.
Because that's where the foul occurred. It doesn't happen very often. Usually when a player can get blocked into it as long as he doesn't try. There has to be intent, and there has to be intent with almost all of these fouls, except for maybe 5 yards down the field, something like that. There has to be intent behind it. So a guy can be blocked and have no control over his body at that point, and run into, and then that's not a penalty because that's not his fault. Next.
Tackling or blocking maker of a fair catch or avoidable running into.
Okay, pretty much the same thing. Only this one's a little bit more severe. I think this is subject to possible disqualification if you were to really hit the guy. These are practically the same penalty. So kick catch interference, the first one would most likely be just hitting the ball or just kind of getting in the way, or he muffs it a little bit. A punt returner has an option of he can bobble it a little bit and still get kick catch interference called for him. That's just contact. Tackling or hitting a guy is a bigger penalty. So maybe the kick catch interference is only 5 yards. Tackling or tackling someone or hitting someone hard might be 15. Next.
Blocking below waist on kicks and change of possession.
Okay, so you are not allowed to block below the waist. You can't crock block. You have to keep them up here. Obviously, you can push them from the side as long as they go back a little bit, as long as your head is in front of their shoulder. You can't push from behind, but you can't hit below at all on a kick return, a punt return, or a change of possession. So if a wide receiver were to miss the ball, a defensive back were to catch it, another defensive back could not cut out the wide receiver from preventing the play. He has to keep it up high. This is to prevent, because the field of play is switched, so momentum is switched. It's to prevent knee injuries, ankle injuries, that sort of thing. It's a lot harder to block, but especially from guys who aren't used to blocking, but it is a safety issue, and I believe it's 15 yards. Next.
Roughing the kicker.
Roughing the kicker, there's two different, there's running into the kicker and there's roughing the kicker. Running into the kicker is so have your leg follow through of the kicker. Okay, so running into the kicker would just be something like that. Or if I were to be diving across and just kind of touch his leg, that would be 5 yards. If the kick is within 5 yards of the first down, then that would be a first down, but it's not an automatic first down. Roughing the kicker would be a guy sliding across cannot be underneath the kicker or the punter when they land. So if I were to kick, I have to be able to land completely safe. Otherwise, that's 15 yards. Or if I were to get knocked off my spot. And I think I also have this one highlighted on there that I'll just go to now. There's also the kicker and punter can get in trouble too. If they were to show that they got roughed into when they really weren't, that is, I think that's unsportsmanlike. I think that's 15 yards.
Wow.
And yeah, it's 15 yards. So a kicker, you know, he's the kicker and punter are the second most protected people on the field behind the quarterback because they have less padding. They're used to less. They're not contact. Hopefully, they're not contacting all the time. Obviously, that's different with Huber with the Cleveland Browns. Got knocked under the chin, cracked a vertebrae, broke his jaw. That's different. That should have been a penalty, but that's beside the point. So the kicker can get in trouble too. It's 15 yards. Next penalty.
Striking an opponent with foot or shin in a whipping motion.
Okay, so tripping, whipping. A lot of offensive linemen don't see this. If they fall down and they were to whip a player, you know, you can't just kick at players to try and knock them down. This is 15 yards. I don't even know if you can see my feet. I doubt it. But you get the motion with my upper body. You can't whip around, especially if you're on the ground. You can't try and trip a player to prevent them from getting to the quarterback, getting to the running back. Another safety issue. You know, this isn't seen very often. Sometimes their legs, they allow their legs to go a little loose, so they're a little bit more floppy as they go around. But it has to, once again, it has to be with intent. Next.
Tackling runner who is out of bounds.
Okay, so late hit out of bounds. In order to make a legal contact with a runner, when he is technically out of bounds, you have to either engage him before he's out of bounds and then let him go. You can't rip him to the ground, or if you're in the tackling motion, then that's fine. Or you have to be actively going into tackling. So if he were to be right above the line and you dive, that's legal. Now if it's the quarterback running, a lot of times they're going to call it because they're protecting the quarterback a lot, which they shouldn't protect him that much. But if a player steps out of bounds, if they're clearly going out of bounds, such as the quarterback, you cannot hit him once he is out of bounds. You cannot rough him once he is out of bounds. It's 15 yards, and if you're not on your sideline, you might not make it back onto the field. This is called a lot when quarterbacks run out of bounds because they're close to out of bounds, so the referees think they're safe, and defensive backs have to make that declaration of, well, he could go out of bounds, so I could get 15 yards, or if I don't tackle him, he could sprint up the field right past me because I didn't hit it. So it's a very tough call on defensive backs, but they have gotten a little better with calling that in favor of the defensive backs when they are engaged in the act of tackling. Next.
Illegal crackback.
Illegal crackback, you cannot, this happened in Dominican Sue on Sullivan the first week of the season against the Minnesota Vikings. Basically the same, you cannot hit below the knees on a defensive lineman, and in that case it was Sue hitting Sullivan. You can't knock into him. It's related to the same with defensive linemen engaged with offensive linemen. You can't hit below the legs when they are engaged. So if I were to be engaged with you just like this, and another one of my players, you're the defensive lineman and I'm the offensive lineman, even if I'm just touching you, and another person cuts your legs out, that's 15 yards on that offensive lineman. But if I'm not touching you, that's legal. But on change of possession, like we explained earlier, all that changes. You're not allowed to hit below the waist. Knee issues, especially with offensive, defensive linemen. Offensive linemen get hit on their knees a ton when running backs land on their back of their knees. Wide receivers, not as big a deal. Defensive linemen get hurt a lot more. So it's a safety issue, and it should be 15 yards. And depending on whether you're offense or defense, it could happen on both. Depends on when it occurs. It's 15 yards. Next.
Blindside block.
Blindside block. This happens a lot on punts and on interceptions. If you are behind the ball, you cannot hit someone who is, there have to be two things that occur. You have to have your head in front of their shoulder in order to hit them. That's at any time. And they have to be trying to tackle the guy. There's a third thing, you also have to be behind the ball, ahead of the ball. You have to be ahead of the ball. You can't come backward from the ball and hit someone. That's blindside. It means that they didn't have a chance to properly defend themselves. But if they are 3 yards behind the running back and you come from the side and hit them, as long as your head is in front of their shoulder, that's a legal block. But if I were to just be jogging 30 yards behind the play and someone comes screaming at me from the side and knocks me out, Ken Huber, then that is a 15-yard penalty and possible disqualification because of the serious intent behind that and the serious, because their body is not prepared for it. They're loose and relaxed. They're not actively engaged in trying to make the tackle. They are no longer an active part of the play. Next.
Roughing the passer.
Roughing the passer. There are a few different variations of this. Tom Brady rules, which you talked about this week in Sports with Steve. If you hit a quarterback below the legs with intent, so if you were blocked into it, that's not your fault. But if you were to crawl at him and hit him, or if you were to dive into his legs, that's 15 yards. If you were to make contact with a quarterback on the head, or if you were to launch at him on the head, even if you were to not knock him down, that's 15 yards. If you were to hit the quarterback after he throws and you take more than one step to get to the quarterback, that's 15 yards. They're really protecting the quarterback. This also can get the offensive lineman really fired up, which is not good for your defense. It's a huge momentum swing, 15 yards, no matter if the pass was completed or not, it adds 15 yards. Major safety issue, as it should be. But Scott made the point in Sports with Steve that some quarterbacks are more protected than others, and Michael Vick was always one that I thought was not protected as well as he should be. Eli Manning, another one, just players that seem like they can take more hits. Not necessarily that quarterbacks can't take hits, but quarterbacks who can take more hits and are more mobile, although Eli Manning's not exactly what you call mobile. But Michael Vick, more mobile, should be able to avoid that. I don't think that's fair. I think all quarterbacks should be protected equally. Next.
Using abusive or insulting language or gestures to players or officials or continuing acts.
Okay. Taunting, I don't think this is the same as taunting, but it's because taunting is specifically to a player or a coach. This is suggestive, the middle finger, excessive language. It's 15 yards unsportsmanlike, depending on who you do it to. We saw this with Deshaun Jackson 2 years ago. After a big 50-yard play down the right sideline, he flipped the ball to his opponent's defensive coordinator. That negated the play. Not only did it detract 15 yards, it negated the play. You cannot be excessively active toward coaches, toward players. You have to get back in your own huddle. Swinging at someone, hitting someone. We see this a lot with some shoving on the offensive defensive line. Referees tend to let this go a little bit as long as they can break it up. But if someone were to spit on someone, that's 15 yards. If someone were to swing at someone, well, that's potentially a disqualification. Shoving, that sort of thing, that could be 15 yards. And I think, is taunting the next one?
Yes.
Okay, taunting, very similar, except this is directly related. So if I were to knock Scott on the ground as a defensive back, and he were to get back up, and I were to be right in his face and making gestures toward him and yelling at him when he wouldn't be smiling, but just making gestures toward him, especially as defensive back or a wide receiver who makes a big play, spinning the ball or throwing the ball at or near in the direction of the person who you're taunting, making gestures toward a coach. It doesn't have to be anything more than pointing, but that is taunting. They're really trying to crack down on that, trying to create a more, not necessarily more fair, but a more sportsmanlike environment for the players, so that way there's not as much roughhousing and as much taunting and as much ego in the game anymore. That's 15 yards, and it could negate the play, as we saw with Deshaun Jackson. Next.
Player pushing, shoving, or laying hand on official.
Yeah, you can't touch an official ever. They are above the law. They are the law and above the law. You can't ever touch. If you were to, if the official would be going over here and you were to accidentally run into him, that's in the field of play. Or, if the umpire and the linebackers, if he gets run over by a wide receiver on a crossing route, that's in the field of play. He's a part of the field of play. But if a referee throws a penalty on you and you go up and go like this, that's most likely going to be an ejection. That's at least a fine from the NFL. You cannot touch an NFL referee. We saw this with Bill Belichick last year after the Ravens kicked a field goal over the Patriots, over the uprights. That was questionable, but over the uprights, that's up to the referee's judgment. We saw him grab a referee and pull him a little bit. He got fined heavily, as he should have. NFL referees are above and beyond the law. You cannot ever touch them, and it's a 15-yard penalty and possible ejection from the game. Next.
Attempting to disconcert Team A at snap by words or signals.
Okay, so if as a defensive lineman, if I were to simulate a snap count, as a defensive lineman, if I were to give the snap count, that's false start on me. It's the only time a false start can be called on defense, otherwise it's neutral zone infraction. It's the only time a false start can be called on me, or if I'm stomping at him, or making gestures to cause the offensive lineman to snap the ball, causing a false start even if I'm not in the neutral zone. That's on the defense, and I think it's only a 5-yard penalty. But defensive linemen cannot simulate the snap count. They can pump out, they can move a little bit, but they cannot vocally or physically simulate a snap count. So hopefully this will help you understand a little bit more about the penalties in the NFL, so that way you can when you're watching a game, be more objective, be smarter about the penalties, and you can yell at the referees more if you want to when they miss a call. You'll actually know what they're talking about, whether it's pass interference or an eligible receiver downfield, what have you. Neutral zone infraction, we went over that. 5-yard penalties on the defense. There's neutral zone infraction. There's holding. Defensive penalties are much tougher to overcome than offensive penalties, because most offensive penalties, loss of 5 yards, loss of 10 yards, loss of 15 yards, whatever, they still get to retain their down. There are only 2 major loss of down penalties. That's illegal touching. No, I don't think it's illegal touching. Maybe there's only one. There might only be one, and that's intentional grounding, where the quarterback is in the pocket and throws the ball to an empty spot or out of bounds, doesn't reach the line of scrimmage, or he's out of the pocket and he throws the ball and doesn't reach the line of scrimmage and goes out of bounds. So I think that's the only loss of down, and that's symbolized by that. So hopefully, after my battling, you'll understand a little bit more about penalties. Hopefully I've made it clearer for you. If there are any penalties that you still don't understand, any penalties you want me to cover, any questions you have for me, at SVSU Iowa, svsuiowa@gmail.com for any and all questions. Be sure to tune in with Sports with Steve every week. We'll go over all the teams that mean the most to you. This has been a bit of a penalties recap. Thank you for watching.